What major types of ships do you know? Probably the first ships that come to mind are battleships, frigates, and of course, aircraft carriers. The latter, by the way, are considered the largest ships and reach gigantic sizes. For example, the largest ships of this class owned by the United States reach 1,089 feet in length, 131 feet in width, and 239 feet in height, which can be compared to the size of an average shopping center. Given that the first Nimitz-class aircraft carrier was created by the United States in 1975 at the height of the Cold War, the USSR was not able to stand aside and actively worked on its aircraft carriers, which resulted in Project 1143 carriers. The most interesting of which can be considered the aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov. This ship is interesting not only because it is comparable in size with its Western rival, namely it is 1,003 feet long, 232 feet wide, and 213 feet high, and even has a comparable number of aircraft, 50 airplanes and helicopters, compared to 64 on the American carrier. But unlike the American carriers, this ship was a complete disaster for the Russians. The first problem of the ship was that the original drawings of the ship of this class did not take into account the flight deck for the planes, and they were able to serve exclusively as carriers for Ka-27 helicopters, which brought its own difficulties to the further construction of a universal aircraft carrier with a flight deck. The second problem was in the shipyard where it was being built. Admiral Kuznetsov was built at the Black Sea shipyard in the Ukrainian city of Nikolaev, which greatly limited the location of the aircraft carrier exclusively to the waters of the Black Sea, because neighboring countries such as Romania, Turkey, and Bulgaria would not have been very happy about the movement of such a vessel along their coasts. Moreover, its construction at the Ukrainian shipyard became evident in November 1991. Literally 1 month before the breakup of the USSR, the Ukrainian RSR claimed ownership of the ship, which did not prevent the ship from leaving the Ukrainian waters, but put the legal status of the ship under a lot of doubt. The most interesting part of the history of this aircraft carrier began in the 21st century. Unlike the US, which is constantly working on the technical condition and modernization of its equipment, Russia did not give much thought to these issues, which can generally be seen from the Russian equipment destroyed in Ukraine. In 2016, the Admiral Kuznetsov, apparently unmaintained since its construction, was sent to the Mediterranean Sea to carry out combat missions in Syria. Even before arriving at the deployment points, the ship managed to become a laughingstock and even spawned memes. The reason for the mockery was that the supposedly modern aircraft carrier emitted more smoke than the steamships of the early 20th century. In honor of this, it was even compared to a volcano. Fleet Command even tried to justify the shortcoming by saying that this is the norm even for the NATO fleet, and the smoke on the Kuznetsov was noticed only due to the high exhaust pipe, which, according to the ship's captain, can be considered a reason to be proud. And trouble followed not only the ship itself. Everything that touched it was also subjected to severe challenges. For example, in less than a month, 2 fighters on the deck of the Kuznetsov were destroyed. One fighter could not take off and simply collapsed into the water right from the takeoff deck, and the second, Su-33, could not land and fell into the water because of the broken stopping cable. And the funny thing is, in the second case, the cause of the accident was recognized not to be the lack of maintenance of the aircraft, but the unprofessionalism of the pilot. And airplanes aren't the only things that were ruined because of the unlucky aircraft carrier. In 2018, the ship was finally sent to the PD-50 floating dock for long-awaited maintenance. It would seem that this is not a very difficult task, because the aircraft carrier stands in place, secured to the dock, and there can be no risks here. But do not underestimate the power of Russian engineering genius. Because of workers' lack of professionalism, poor design, or maybe a strong wind, a 70-ton crane on the deck of the ship simply collapsed onto the dry dock, flooding it. A year later, the aircraft carrier suffered another mishap, and again during maintenance. During routine welding work, a fire broke out aboard the ship that caused nearly $1 billion worth of damage, killing 2 people and injuring a dozen other workers in varying severity. The aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov can rightly be called one of the biggest failures in the history of shipbuilding. After all, not only did it inflict a huge number of losses while becoming the laughingstock of the Russian Navy, it did not even bring any benefit during its service because it was used only in combat operations in Syria, and even there it did not show high efficiency. For all that, it is assumed that in 2013, this aircraft carrier is to return to service, which is probably not surprising given the love of the Russian military command for rare and useless equipment. And this aircraft carrier is far from Russia's first experience in building junk. The Admiral Kuznetsov can safely be called a worthy successor to an entire class of ships, namely the line ships of the Sevastopol type. Sevastopol or Genguts is a class of battleships built by the Russian Empire in 1911. They were built in St. Petersburg at the Baltic shipyard. These ships had a length of 593 feet and a beam of 88 feet. Considering the time when they were designed and built, these ships did not possess engines in their modern form. These battleships were steam-powered vessels, equipped with 25 boilers and 10 turbines, which gave them a speed of up to 23 knots and a range of 2,485 miles. The armor of these ships was quite light for its class, but it allowed the ship to reach a good maximum speed. Overall, if you compare this battleship in terms of technical characteristics with its competitors, it may not seem so bad. But the main snag lies in the armament of these ships and their history. The ships of this class were armed with 12 305mm rifled guns arranged in 4 3-gun turrets as main guns, 8 47mm guns, 4 guns each on the first and fourth turrets for anti-aircraft use, and 4 440mm underwater torpedo launchers. And although the list of guns used on the ship sounds rather impressive, in fact, the main guns were one of the major problems of this class of ship. The turrets fitted with them were positioned in a straight line, exactly along the center of the ship, which allowed maximum fire potential only in linear fire. If the enemy was behind or in front of the ship, only one of the gun turrets could fire, and ships of this class could not fire all guns simultaneously. They were limited to firing one turret at a time, so even with linear fire, the ship could not show its full potential. Besides, such arrangements of the turrets greatly reduced the space for storing ammunition and space for the engine compartments. The Sevastopol's problems did not end there. The ships had a rather low silhouette, which on the one hand was an advantage because it was harder to hit a low ship. But on the other hand, the low height not only limited the space on the ship and worsened her performance in rough seas, but also did not allow effective use of additional guns as mine defenses in high waves, because the casemates with guns could be flooded. The history of these ships was not the most successful either. They had practically no real use on the battlefield and were not actively used either in World War I or in World War II. As a consequence, their very creation can be recognized as pointless. In addition, of the 4 ships created, one burned while stationary and was simply written off, and a second was almost destroyed using transportation from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Overall, there is no way Sevastopol could have survived a fight with a British or German ship of the same class. But the USSR, Russia, and the Russian Empire were not the only ones to experience severe failures in naval shipbuilding. The Japanese surprisingly also had problems with it. Given the location of that nation, one would assume that these folks just have to know about shipbuilding and be the kings of the seas. But no. A perfect example of the opposite is the flagship of the Japanese Navy during World War II, called the Yamato. The Yamato is the early flagship battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Construction of the ship began in 1937, and as early as 1941, it was ready for service and accepted into the ranks of the Navy. The Yamato was indeed a very promising and outstanding project. Even more, this battleship is considered one of the largest warships in the history of mankind. With one hitch, it got sunk and didn't gain much glory in combat. The name Yamato for the ship was chosen for a reason. It was supposed to be the symbol of the indestructibility of the Japanese imperial fleet, and a symbol of the greatness of the entire empire, because Yamato is the old name of Japan itself, and the name of one of the prefectures. But unfortunately, the flagship failed to live up to the expectations placed on it. The flagship led the Japanese fleet in several battles. The first naval battle for it was the battle near the Midway Atoll in June 1942, where it served as a floating headquarters for the command. This battle resulted in it being hit by an American torpedo, but it remained afloat and was later sent out for repairs and upgrades. Yamato's second battle was the battle in the Philippine Sea in June 1943. This was the first battle in which the Yamato fired its guns, which by the way was extremely unsuccessful, because it fired on its own aircraft. The third battle of the battleship took place in the same waters, but in October 1944. Most likely, according to the original plans of the Japanese command, Yamato was not to engage in open combat. But the situation of the Japanese Navy was such that all major aircraft carriers by then had either been destroyed or disabled, forcing all available battleships to go into battle. In this battle, the Yamato, according to further research, never once hit an American ship with its main gun. At the end of November 1944, Yamato was sent to the coast of Japan for maintenance, and just 3 months later, in April 1945, American troops landed in Okinawa, forcing Japan to send a combat unit led by Yamato to intercept. On April 7th, upon its arrival at the enemy's location, the entire Japanese combat unit was attacked by the US Navy and Air Force, with the result that Yamato received about 10 torpedo hits and 13 aerial bomb hits. As a result of the attack, the ammunition in the bow detonated and the ship sank. Virtually, the entire crew perished, with only 269 of nearly 3,500 crew members rescued. The Yamato is an example of how an ambitious project that was supposed to bring victory and glory while becoming a symbol of Japanese power became rather one of the biggest military failures. After all, it hardly participated in combat, causing even Japanese soldiers to ridicule its uselessness. And in those battles in which it did take part, it was of no use whatsoever. It would seem that the flagship battleship was not involved in the fighting, stood almost all the time in the rear, and ingloriously sunk near its own shores. What could be worse? And there are a lot worse. An excellent example is the Swedish royal flagship Vasa, which in contrast to Yamato, could not even survive its first voyage. The Vasa was built in Sweden in the 17th century, during the reign of King Gustav II Adolf. The galleon was commissioned for use as the flagship of the Swedish Navy and was considered one of the most beautiful and stately ships of its time. Vasa was built from oak wood covered with copper and was decorated with many sculptures and carvings. The ship had 3 masts and 64 bronze cannons. However, despite its imposing appearance, the ship proved unsuccessful in terms of construction and seaworthiness. During its first voyage in 1628, the Vasa capsized and sank in the port of Stockholm. The reason for the disaster was that the ship was too tall and narrow, and its center of gravity was too high. In addition, the ship was overloaded with the very same bronze cannons, because the maximum number of guns for such a ship is 36, and the Vasa had almost twice as many. As a result of the shipwreck, about 30 men died, and the reputation of the Royal Navy was badly damaged. The ship was forgotten for many years, but in the 1950s was discovered and brought to the surface. Today, the Vasa is a major tourist attraction in Sweden and is housed in a museum in Stockholm. It is one of the best preserved ships of the 17th century, and its beautiful carvings and sculptures make it a unique historical artifact. By the way, thanks to the disaster of this galleon, there is a term, Vasa syndrome, which emphasizes problems in communication and project management, leading to total failure. And we can apply this term to the next vessel on our list, the Massachusetts BB-2. USS Massachusetts BB-02 was a first-class ship in the US Navy that belonged to the Indiana type of ships. The construction of the ship began in 1890, and literally 1 year later, on July 25, 1891, it was completed and launched. But the ship did not become publicly known until 1893. It was supposed to be one of the main battleships of the Navy, and to celebrate it, an audience of about 15,000 people was even assembled, but things didn't go quite according to plan. Instead of a huge and majestic battleship, the people saw a low and unimpressive ship that moved with difficulty even without any particular combat load. Already at this point, one could easily recognize the ship's design as a failure. 1 year. One could call that a very rapid ship construction, especially a first-class battleship which was essentially supposed to be the strongest weapon in the fleet, and carry a powerful armament including artillery, machine guns, and torpedo launchers. Such haste in production led to the fact that the ship was sent for modernization many times because of its shortcomings. The Massachusetts' main flaw, however, was very ridiculous and comical. The ship could not keep its balance on the water while rotating the turrets that housed the main 330mm guns. Because the rotation of the turrets shifted the center of gravity of the ship tilted in the direction in which the guns were aimed. And the tilt was so strong that part of the deck and side 203mm guns were submerged, The ship simply wasn't designed for the number and weight of the guns which were mounted on it. In addition, the height of the ship limited its use to coastal areas, for if the Massachusetts had gone out into the open sea, it would have been simply flooded by the waves. As for the use of the Massachusetts, its first combat action was during the Spanish-American War, in which it was not able to contribute because it was sent to replenish its coal supply on the day of the decisive battle. And this was probably for the best, for given its features, the ship would probably have sunk simply by pointing the guns in the direction of the enemy. Immediately thereafter, the Massachusetts was sent out for military exercises, during which a disaster occurred aboard, an explosion of 203mm cannon killing 9 crew members. As a result, the ship was sent for repairs and was decommissioned from the fleet in 1906. In 1910, the command decided to return the Massachusetts to service, but this time the technical features of the ship were taken into account and it was not positioned as a warship. It was used for the annual officer's sale and then entered the reserves. The ship was retired in 1919, all without any special honors or publicity, unlike its first demonstration. The ship was stripped of its Massachusetts name to give that name to the new Massachusetts series ship BB-54 going forward. The ship was launched into the Gulf of Mexico and used as a training target for experimental artillery, which resulted in its sinking. In spite of everything, this ship still managed to do some good, at least in the form of a target. Do you know of any other failed ship models? Feel free to write about it in the comments. And also do not forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. If you want to support the channel financially, the link to our Patreon page is in the description. See ya!